7 years, that was the sentence. I stood beside the absolute Alpha King, a queen who secured his throne but could not secure his touch. Our marriage was a contract of ice, defined by his impenetrable distance. I mastered the art of composure, learning to silence the woman hidden beneath the crown, accepting the silent pity of the realm. But the fragile peace of the 7th year demanded a price. It was not my pride that fractured, but the deepest part of my being. Suddenly, my body erupted in a primal, consuming heat, a force that transcended politics and poise. My soul betrayed my dignity, sending an unmistakable signal throughout the kingdom, claiming me as no longer a choice. The granite walls of Obsidian Keep were not merely structural, they were emotional barriers, thick and cold, mirroring the reality of my marriage. For 7 years, I navigated these silent, echoing halls, a ghost in my own gilded cage. My composure was my crown, heavier and more necessary than the solid gold circlet I sometimes wore. I am Evelyn Hayes, 29, and the world knew me as the queen who secured the peace, a political triumph cemented by a treaty, not by love. My duty, clearly outlined in the heavy parchment of the Lycan Succession Treaty, was to be a stabilizing force, and crucially, to provide an heir. That last clause, the very reason for my existence within this fortress, had gone spectacularly unfulfilled. My husband, Maxwell Thorne, 33, the formidable Alpha King, governed this vast territory with a detached efficiency that terrified and stabilized the realm in equal measure. He saw me only as an asset, a signature on a contract, a lineage secured, never as a woman, never as his true mate. Our interactions were clipped, formal, centered on political updates and logistical planning. He was an impenetrable wall of duty, his eyes, those cold, penetrating gray mirrors, rarely meeting mine for longer than professionalism required. This neglect had become the public theater of the Gilded Court. Every reception, every ceremony was a silent referendum on my failure. I learned to wear the weight of pity with practiced grace, perfecting the art of the slight, serene smile. I pinned the Frostheart brooch to my gown daily, a glacial diamond meant to symbolize my lineage, but which, to me, represented the absolute, chilling coldness of my position. It was a shield, warding off the vulnerability that lay coiled deep inside. I thought I had won. I thought my political mind and steely resolve had defeated the deep, instinctual longing of the mate bond. I believed my survival depended on this emotional distance. 7 years had proven me resilient. But resilience is a political mask, and instinct is the soul's true command. The arrival of the Settimo Anno brought with it an unsettling change. The diplomatic tensions, which our marriage was meant to stabilize, finally settled into a fragile, lasting peace. With the external threats diminished, the focus of the court, the advisors, and the ancient Lycan bloodlines shifted wholly onto the internal matter, the heir. The pressure was a physical weight, crushing the carefully organized architecture of my self-control. I was in my private chambers within Obsidian Keep, preparing for the evening's council session, when the shift occurred. It wasn't a gentle stirring, it was a volcanic eruption, sudden and total. One moment, I was pinning the Frostheart brooch, admiring the sharp, unyielding purity of the diamonds. The next, a profound, agonizing heat ripped through my core, shattering the cold facade I had maintained for so long. It was not mere desire. It was a primal, desperate imperative, a catastrophic physical demand that superseded every political lesson and every shred of regal composure I possessed. My knees buckled. I gripped the heavy velvet drapery, gasping as my dormant wolf, silent and suppressed for 7 years, finally raged free. It was furious, starved, and utterly demanding. Claim. Now, the wolf's voice was a raw, guttural echo in my skull, overriding the measured, strategic voice of Queen Evelyn. My body was sending signals, potent and undeniable, not merely localized heat, but a deep territorial scent that screamed through the ancient stone of the keep, directly to the one man who had refused to acknowledge my existence beyond a signature. This was the Queen's public claim, not through words or treaties, but through the elemental force of the bond finally snapping. I had spent years masking the ache of rejection. Now, my very biology was screaming for him to reverse it. I stumbled out of my chambers, the meticulous control completely gone. My breath came in ragged, burning bursts. My skin flushed a furious red beneath my pale gown. I knew, instinctively, that the signal had reached him. It was impossible for an Alpha King of his power to ignore this kind of demand from his bonded mate, even if he had ignored me for 7 years. This scent, this heat, was meant to break his political detachment, to force the collision of ice and volcanic heat. I did not stop to compose myself. I couldn't. The wolf drove me straight to the central tower where the council was gathering. When I burst through the ornate mahogany doors of the council chamber, a room usually reserved for somber negotiations and the dry recitation of laws, every head snapped toward me. The murmurs died instantly. The room was heavy with the presence of high-ranking Lycans, but their fear and shock were negligible compared to the figure standing at the head of the table. Maxwell Thorne stood rigid, his imposing frame dominating the space. His council reports lay scattered on the table, forgotten. His usual mask of detached efficiency was cracked. His cold gray eyes, now blazing silver, were fixed solely on me. His nostrils flared, deep breaths dragging the potent air I was flooding the room with, the scent of a queen demanding her alpha. He hadn't moved, yet the air around him felt charged, violently unstable. His polished facade, the one that had protected him from feeling anything for 7 long years, was visibly crumbling under the sheer unexpected force of my physical declaration. "Evelyn," he articulated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence. It wasn't a question, but a warning, perhaps a desperate attempt to impose order on a situation that was rapidly spiraling into the purely primal. I took a step forward, the floor tiles seeming to hum beneath my bare feet. I hadn't bothered with slippers. The political calculations, the fear of public shame, the carefully constructed dignity, it all evaporated like mist in a sudden solar flash. There was only the heat, the demand, and the absolute need to be recognized as more than a political consort. 7 years, I managed, the word a rasp in my dry throat. My hand trembled, reaching out toward him, not in supplication, but in a challenge. 7 years you have kept me on ice, Maxwell. You secured your treaty, guaranteed your peace, and meticulously avoided the one truth that binds us. His jaw clenched so hard I heard the slight grinding of bone. The silver in his eyes deepened, a sign that his own formidable wolf was finally reacting to the raw force of my mate call. His control was fraying. The Alpha King, who lived and breathed duty, was confronting an instinct that trumped all governing power. "You will contain yourself, Queen," he ordered, his voice laced with the cold authority he wielded so effectively. I laughed, a ragged, breathless sound utterly unlike the Queen Evelyn they knew. "Contain? You think this is a matter of protocol? This is blood, Maxwell. This is the bond you denied, and it has finally decided that the Setemoano is over." I felt the last barrier of shame dissolve. I was standing before the most powerful Lycan in the territories, before his entire council, radiating a claim so potent it made the very air thick. My body was screaming for him to fulfill the treaty's silent clause in the most fundamental way possible. He took a step, a seismic movement that cleared the council members from his path. The distance between us, the figurative gulf of 7 years, was now measured in mere feet. The heat intensified, a burning connection that slammed into him. I could see the internal battle waged behind his eyes, the ruthless ruler fighting the possessive alpha, who finally understood that his territory included me. "If you move any closer, Evelyn," he growled, "there is no going back to the political theater." "There is no going back," I confirmed, my voice dropping to a seductive, demanding whisper, fueled entirely by the wolf. "The contract is done. The peace is secure. Now, I demand the completion of the bond. I demand what is mine." I let the heat spike one last time, a direct, deliberate attack on his composure. It was a challenge, a plea, and an undeniable threat all in one. He had ignored the queen. He could not ignore his mate in Rut. The Alpha King shattered. With a speed that defied human vision, Maxwell was across the room, his hands clamped down on my hips, pulling my burning body against his iron frame. The force of the connection was staggering, a collision of ice and pure, molten fire that nearly knocked the breath out of me. The low growl vibrating in his chest was raw, possessive, and terrifyingly satisfying. "You have shattered everything," he murmured against my temple, his breath hot, his scent a dark, woodsy, absolute dominance, finally enveloping me after 7 years of starvation. "Good," I managed, arching against him, demanding the acknowledgement that was due. The council room, the keep, the years of neglect, it all faded into background static. There was only the immediate, inescapable reality of his grip, the desperate sound of his inhaled breath, and the final, savage surrender of the Alpha King. He lifted me, his arms locking around my waist, his cold gray eyes now a molten silver blaze fixed on mine. He was no longer the detached ruler. He was the wolf, finally claiming his territory. The Lycan succession treaty, the fragile peace, the ornamental position, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the physical proof that the 7 years of coldness had ended, violently and completely. The man who had refused to touch me for so long finally did, and the world, our world, redefined itself in that instant of primal, undeniable heat. He didn't ask, he took. He didn't negotiate, he claimed, and my body, finally answered, sinking into the truth of the Alpha's possession. The air in the council chamber, thick moments before with the scent of fear and potent lichen political maneuvering, now felt like molten lead, centered entirely around the savage intensity of Maxwell's grip. He didn't merely hold me, he anchored me, possessive and absolute, against a chest that was vibrating with a deep, territorial rumble. The council members, the highest-ranking lichens who had spent 7 years observing my calculated composure, were frozen. Their shock was palpable, a testament to how profoundly Maxwell's cold detachment had defined our public dynamic. They had watched the Queen maintain glacial distance. Now, they were witnessing her immediate, unavoidable claim. Maxwell's eyes, those relentless mirrors of duty, were now entirely consumed by his wolf. The familiar cold gray was entirely replaced by a swirling, violent silver that seemed to burn straight into my core. He inhaled sharply, drawing in the heat and the pheromones that were pouring off me, the undeniable proof of my body's rebellion. "Look at them," I whispered, the sound husky, utterly foreign to the composed Queen Evelyn. The shame I should have felt, the complete annihilation of my regal facade, was utterly overridden by the fierce, triumphant satisfaction of finally forcing his hand. They finally see. The contract failed, Maxwell. Only the bond remains. He pressed his thumb brutally into the soft flesh of my hip, a silent, painful reprimand that only served to intensify the heat already consuming me. "You force my instincts, Evelyn. You force a collision you may not survive. I am surviving the 7 years of ice," I countered, throwing my head back, demanding he meet the defiance in my eyes. "Survival requires heat, Alpha. Claim what you own, or watch your kingdom burn under the pressure of a queen demanding her mate." The Alpha King had spent years building an impregnable fortress around his heart, ruling from a place of sterile logic. But logic could not withstand the volcanic heat of a mate in rut. His control snapped not with a bang, but with a sudden, devastating movement. He didn't speak another command or offer a political excuse. He simply lifted me, swinging me effortlessly into his arms. I clung to his neck instantly, a desperate, instinctual movement that discarded every rule of decorum I had ever known. My pale gown, designed for courtly elegance, was a flimsy barrier against the searing heat radiating from his body. The council room dissolved behind us. I heard the frantic scrambling of the advisors, the High Chancellor calling out a useless, "Your Majesty," but Maxwell ignored them all. He moved with the focused, devastating speed of a predator who has finally cornered his prey. The transition from the council chamber to the private wings of Obsidian Keep was a blur of stone arches and echoing silence. This immense fortress, my prison of polished marble and cold history, felt different now. It was no longer a symbol of neglect, but a vast, silent witness to the savage, late-blooming claim of its ruler. I looked down and realized that in the chaos of my initial rush, the Frostheart brooch, my symbol of icy reserve, had fallen from my gown. I didn't care. The diamonds were meaningless. They held no warmth, and warmth was now all that mattered. Maxwell's scent, dark cedar, sharp winter air, and absolute power, was intoxicating, overwhelming the sterile scent of the keep. I buried my face against his neck, inhaling him deeply, starved for this primal anchor. 7 years. 7 years of polite distance, of clipped formalities, of sleeping separated by immense wings of this ancient complex. Now, every molecule of my being was screaming, "Mine, mine, mine." He did not take me to my chambers. He strode instead toward his own, the most heavily fortified, most private sanctuary in Obsidian Keep. The air grew thicker with the scent of his rising arousal, a dark counterpoint to my demanding heat. This journey, carried in his arms, felt like the true binding ceremony, the one that transcended the political treaty. When he kicked open the massive, iron-bound door to his private apartments, the sound was deafening. He didn't bother with lights. The room was bathed in the pale, lunar glow filtering through the narrow, high windows. His quarters were Spartan, reflecting his nature: dark wood, heavy furs, and an atmosphere of relentless, controlled power. He slammed me against the closed door, his mouth crashing down on mine before I could draw a breath. The kiss was everything the 7 years were not: brutal, demanding, immediate, and utterly consuming. It wasn't tender or exploratory. It was a violent claiming, an aggressive seizure of territory that had been meticulously ignored. His taste was intoxicating, a metallic tang of wolf, dominance, and long-repressed frustration. I responded instantly, fiercely, matching his hunger with 7 years of pent-up need. My hands tangled in his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer, desperate to eliminate the tiny sliver of air between us. He broke the kiss only to growl against my jaw, a sound so guttural it shook my teeth. "You tried to break me, Evelyn. You deliberately brought this savage need into the light. You denied me for 7 years. I gasped, the heat surging, making my vision swim. I needed to know if you were a man or just a crown. He didn't answer with words. He answered with action. His hands tore at the bodice of my gown, the expensive silk ripping easily under the fierce strength of his grip. The garment, the last vestige of Queen Evelyn, the political consort, fell in crumpled heap to the cold stone floor. This was the true climax, the point of no return. The collision of ice and volcanic heat was now purely physical, elemental, and terrifyingly swift. Maxwell was abandoning every fiber of his political identity. He was only alpha. He swept me toward the center of the room, tossing me onto the massive bed layered with dark furs. The contrast of the cold air on my flushed skin and the raw heat of the furs beneath me was electric. He stood over me for a terrifying moment, pulling his own tailored jacket and heavy tunic off in swift, practiced movements. The sheer, imposing musculature of his frame, hidden for so long beneath the formality of his royal attire, was devastating. He was built for war and for command, and now for this. His gray eyes, still molten silver, devoured me. There was no pity, no detachment, only a ravenous, possessive hunger that made my dormant wolf sing with profound satisfaction. You wanted the alpha, he stated, his voice now a low tremor, stripped of all royal authority. You will have him. There is nothing left of the king in this room tonight. He moved onto the bed, the heavy furs sinking beneath his weight. His weight settled over me, oppressive and utterly thrilling. He was dense, solid, the absolute representation of the power I had spent 7 years trying to respect from a distance. The initial shock of the public confrontation had been the political breaking point. This moment, the moment his skin finally met mine without the barrier of clothing, was the ultimate surrender. His touch was consuming. Where 7 years ago I had been a political pawn, now I was his mate, his territory, the central focus of a long-suppressed, dangerous intensity. He didn't caress. He branded, his large, calloused hands tracing lines of fire across my skin. He moved lower, his focus intense, tracing the curve of my hip where his hand had initially clamped down in the council. The scent was dizzying, overwhelming my senses, until the only reality was the heat and the power of the man above me. 7 years of discipline, he murmured, his breath hot on my ear, sounding genuinely tormented. 7 years of cold. I taught myself to hate the vulnerability of the bond. I convinced myself the realm was safer if I didn't need you. He lifted his head, his face a mask of primal regret and searing need. I was wrong. He claimed me then, with a ferocity born of necessity and 7 years of deliberate starvation. The pain was immediate, sharp, and quickly subsumed by the overwhelming, demanding pleasure that followed, a torrent of sensation that ripped through the carefully maintained walls of my emotional reserve. It was not a joining, it was a collision, a devastating impact where the ice I had meticulously cultivated shattered against the volcanic force of his suppressed need. We were two forces that had ignored the laws of attraction for too long, finally crashing together in a catastrophic necessary release. The room filled entirely with our mingled scents, dominance, mating heat, and the sudden heady realization of possession. I gripped his broad shoulders, every muscle in my body straining toward him, answering the primal call that had finally ripped the political world apart. When the storm finally subsided, leaving us both breathless and slick with sweat on the furs, the silence that fell was entirely different from the cold silence of the keep. This was a deep, resonant quiet, filled with the heavy thrum of a bond finally accepted and acted upon. Maxwell did not immediately move away. He remained heavy on me, his heart hammering against my chest, his wolf slowly retreating from the violent edge of claim back into the stabilizing possessiveness of the Alpha King. His fingers, no longer tearing or demanding, moved gently to push the damp platinum hair from my face. The silver had softened slightly in his eyes, reverting closer to the familiar cold gray, but now it was threaded with a new element, absolute, undeniable ownership. Evelyn, he said, his voice husky, exhausted. He was speaking my name not as a queen or a strategic asset, but as his mate. We destroyed the political reality tonight. I traced the harsh line of his jaw, the Lycan succession treaty, the fragile peace secured by my marriage, the silent pity of the gilded court. All of it felt distant, irrelevant. The only truth was the weight of his body, and the residual ache of a fulfillment that had been 7 years overdue. Good, I repeated, closing my eyes, sinking into the profound, anchoring warmth of his presence. The cold walls of Obsidian Keep no longer felt like barriers. They felt like the boundaries of our territory. The long Sedimo Anno was over. The cold queen was gone, melted away by the primal fire of her own making. The ice had collided with the volcanic heat, and in the aftermath, only the reality of the unbreakable mate bond remained, finally acknowledged, finally claimed. The man who had refused to touch me for 7 long years had finally taken what was his, and my entire being, silenced for so long, finally rested in the devastating truth of his possession. The heavy silence that followed was not the oppressive, empty silence of the obsidian keep I had endured for 7 years, but a dense, living quiet, saturated with the metallic tang of exertion and the profound, stabilizing musk of Maxwell's claimed victory. The furs beneath us were damp, clinging to my skin, and the air was thick, charged with residual energy. I lay beneath him, anchored by his substantial weight, utterly spent, yet vibrating with an astonishing, terrifying completeness. My fingers, still weakly gripping the dark, damp hair at the nape of his neck, felt the rhythmic thrum of his heartbeat, slowly evening out, powerful and steady. He had been a political phantom, a distant, magnificent statue of a man. Now, he was simply gravity, breath, and overwhelming heat. I opened my eyes, adjusting to the weak lunar light. His features, usually carved in stone, and perpetually shadowed by the weight of his crown, were softened by exhaustion. The violent silver of his wolf had receded, leaving the familiar piercing gray, but it was a gray forever altered. It held a raw, exposed quality I had never seen before, a vulnerability that warred visibly with the absolute dominance of his posture. He shifted, lifting his head just enough to look at me, his breath warm on my forehead. His touch, which had been brutal and demanding moments before, was now a light pressure, as his thumb slowly smoothed the skin of my jawline, tracing the outline of my mouth. "You feel different," he finally articulated, the words rough, scraping against the silence. "You are different," I countered, my voice still raw from screaming his name into the silence of his fortress. The king detached himself for 7 years. The Alpha could not sustain that lie. He didn't pull away, but the muscle in his jaw twitched violently. He was wrestling with the transition, the abrupt, shattering realization that the cold, calculated distance he had maintained was now irrevocably broken, replaced by an undeniable, potent proximity. "I built an existence around denying instinct," he confessed, the admission heavy, almost painful. "The realm needed stability, Evelyn. The treaty was a fragile thing. If I had acknowledged the bond, truly acknowledged the power you hold over me, it would have been perceived as weakness. The political maneuvering would have been compromised. I chose the crown over the mate. And you thought that would silence the mate?" I asked, a bitter sadness threading through my exhaustion. "You sacrificed us both on the altar of political necessity. Did you truly believe I was so easily dismissed? A cold piece of art to ornament your throne?" He lowered his head, pressing his forehead against mine, his scent engulfing me. No longer the sharp cedar of a distant ruler, but the deep, grounding earth of a possessive mate. "I needed the detachment to rule," he insisted, his voice a low growl of self-justification. "I saw the way the bond would demand everything. I convinced myself I was protecting the territories from the instability of a demanding passion. I convinced myself that the Lycan succession treaty was the only necessary bond between us." My hand moved to his chest, feeling the thick, damp, furred skin just above his heart. "It was never about stability, Maxwell. It was about fear. You feared being reliant on me. You feared the chaos that comes when logic is overridden by the primal truth." He let out a sharp, ragged exhalation, a sound of profound frustration. "You are not wrong. Every day, every meeting in the Gilded Court, every evening I watched you seated across from me, radiating composure. I felt the drag of the bond, the internal pressure to cross the immense distance I had imposed. It was a torture I inflicted on us both, believing it was duty, until my body forced the issue. I finished, a triumphant edge returning to my voice despite the weariness. The shame that might have crushed the queen vanished under the fierce satisfaction of the mate. I had won the war not through politics or maneuvering, but through elemental necessity. My body's scream had been louder than his political decree. He shifted his weight slightly, rolling to his side, but keeping me pinned against the furs, his leg thrown possessively over mine. The action was purely territorial, a silent reaffirmation that I was not going anywhere, and neither was he. "That heat," he muttered, his eyes closing briefly as if reliving the moment in the council chamber. "It was inescapable. It flooded the keep. You did not just ask for attention. You broadcast the claim to every Lycan within the keep walls. You forced my hand in the most public, absolute way possible. Was there another option?" I challenged, meeting his gaze. 7 years. I wore the frost, Maxwell. I wore the Frostheart brooch as a symbol of my perfected coldness, but the core of me is fire. You demanded I freeze, and eventually, the ice cracked. He reached for my hand, interlacing our fingers. A simple, intimate gesture that spoke volumes more than the elaborate binding ceremony ever had. His skin against mine felt like the final, indelible signature on a contract far older and more powerful than the paper treaty. "The treaty is dead," he stated, his grip tightening. "It served its purpose for the realm's peace, but it is irrelevant to us now. The bond is all that remains." I felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly brought me to tears. To hear him admit it, to shed the political armor, and stand before me, Alpha, claiming his mate, was the true victory. It was the end of the lonely nights, the silent meals, the agonizing pity of the court. "And now what, Alpha?" I asked, testing the word, letting the deference flow naturally, but it was deference born of acceptance, not servitude. "We have scorched the earth of our previous reality. We cannot return to the roles we played." A faint, almost predatory smile curved the edge of his mouth, the first hint of genuine emotion I had ever seen there that wasn't duty or frustration. "No, the king has been severely disciplined by his queen, but the Alpha has been starving." He didn't need to elaborate. The possessive way he gazed at me, the way his body language screamed ownership, confirmed that the starvation of 7 years would not be satisfied in a single night. This collision was not an event. It was a devastating beginning. "The court will talk," I whispered, thinking momentarily of the wide-eyed council members witnessing their king's complete dissolution of control. "The nobles will see the change." "Let them," Maxwell scoffed, dismissing the political observers who had been the silent judges of our fractured marriage. "They will see a claimed queen and an Alpha king who has finally fulfilled the singular duty that transcends all governance, the maintenance of his bond. They will see stability now, Evelyn. Not the fragile stability of a paper treaty, but the absolute, uncompromising strength of the Lycan-mate bond." He pulled me closer, burying his face in the curve of my neck, breathing in my residual mating scent, an act of sheer, possessive contentment. The rhythmic inhale and exhale against my skin was the most intimate sound I had ever known. "You took a massive risk, broadcasting your heat that way," he murmured against my pulse point. "You could have undermined everything. You left me no choice," I replied softly, running my fingers through the thick, coarse texture of his hair. "I lived the Settimo Anno expecting the political peace to break, the pressure for an heir to crush me. I decided if I was to break, I would break spectacularly and take you with me. The alternative was another 7 years of cold." He lifted his head, his eyes burning with a fierce realization. "Never again. I will not return to that cold." This was the closure. This was the final devastating promise that the ice was gone, melted by a force that both terrified and anchored them. The man who had been defined by his efficiency and detachment was now defined by his intense, immediate possession. I felt the last vestiges of the rigid Queen Evelyn slip away. The elegance, the control, the careful mask of indifference. They were artifacts of a survival strategy that was no longer necessary. I was stripped bare, claimed, and finally, truly warm. The Obsidian Keep, outside the confines of this single room, was still a fortress of cold stone, but it was now our fortress, imbued with the deep, anchoring resonance of a bond that had defied politics and instinctual starvation. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him with a fierce tenderness that felt alien, yet entirely correct. The 7-year war was over. The king had been forced to face the consequence of his denial, and in the aftermath of the collision, the queen finally found her true power, not in her composure, but in the overwhelming primal truth of her connection to her mate. We rested, not merely as two exhausted bodies, but as a singularity, cemented by the devastating force of a claim that was 7 years late, but absolute in its arrival. Hit the like button and join the crew by subscribing.